Wondering if the title holds up? Stay tuned to find out. Hey guys, welcome to my channel and welcome to another writing craft book review by yours truly. Ding! Laura Writes. As you guys know, 2020 has been a journey of writing craft for me. I've been reading all the writing craft books and I've been spilling all the tea on them right here for you to let you know whether or not these books are worthy of reading. So in today's writing craft review, I'm going to be reviewing the Fantasy Fiction Formula by Deborah Chester. Okay, now this was the Let's Talk Craft Book Club book choice of the month for August, so we did have a 2-hour long chat about this book. So if you've not seen that yet, I will link that down in the description. Our guest host was Jessica Williamson from her channel Jessica Williamson, as well as of course my brother Kevin the writer, and we discussed this at length for 2 full hours. So after this review, if you want to hear a little bit more about what we thought and how we plan to implement it, or if we wanted to implement it at all, check out that live chat. Also, if you are interested in the Let's Talk Craft Book Club and you don't know what the heck I'm talking about, I am going to link down in the description basically the intro video to that, as well as the information for the next book chat, which is this Sunday, the 27th at 3 p.m. Eastern, and we will be talking about Ursula Le Guin's Steering the Craft. You don't have to read the book to attend. You can just come, hear what we thought about it, and talk craft with us. So, but I don't want to get too much into that because I got a lot to say about this one, so let's dive right in. So basically, this is the Fantasy Fiction Formula by Deborah Chester, and it's kind of a dense one, and it's a newer book. I want to say 2016. So yeah, only in the last 4 years. It is one of the longer choices that we've had, so there's a lot to talk about, you guys. So I try to condense it, and as you guys know, I like to start with the pros, then I get into the cons, and then my overall thoughts, who I recommend it to, if I recommend, that kind of stuff. So this thing is heavy. I'm gonna set it down and then let's get started. Okay, so we're gonna start with the pros as always. So one of the first things I really like that Deborah talks about is somewhere in the book, I want to say it's like in the middle or more toward the end, but she kind of explains a little bit of a difference of writing fantasy versus other genre fiction and other like literary fiction. And she explains that fantasy writing is process driven rather than results driven. This kind of really made sense to me, especially if you read those fantasies where there's a lot of training montages, there's a lot of getting ready, there's a lot of built up. She's basically saying that people want that. They're looking at the process rather than the result. Of course, you can argue with that, and I'm sure there's exceptions, and I'm sure YA fantasy is a little different, but I don't know, in general, just kind of thinking about it like that was an interesting way to frame writing fantasy to think about, just because it kind of tracks with the kinds of things that I have read in fantasy and how I think it's a little bit different than other genres and what you kind of see and what gets emphasized and what the expectations of the genre are. So I thought that that was a really helpful way of kind of framing fantasy writing. Now, the book, a lot of it, which will kind of come up in the con section, so I don't want to spoil anything, but I wouldn't say it spoke that much to fantasy writing. It was more general writing, and there was some good stuff, some pros from her advice on like just general writing in general, but you know what I'm trying to say, overall writing advice. So one of the first things that I liked is she has this acronym, although I don't like to say it, so I'm just gonna tell you the letters, which actually this topic will come up in something else in the cons, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So her acronym is SPOOC, and she says that you should use that as a test to decide if you have enough information to move forward with writing a story. So she basically wants you to set all of your ideas up against that to make sure you have all of those things. So the acronym stands for situation, protagonist, objective, opponent, and climax. And so she says that you need to make sure that you have figured all of those out before you can start moving forward with drafting or writing that book. So I like when people give you kind of like formulas, not formulas on how to write, but like ways to check things or to plug things in, especially in like a pre-writing mode. So I really appreciated that because I definitely have felt like I've gotten into stories where maybe some of those things were missing and I thought that I had them. So just kind of making sure, okay, do I have this? Do I have that before you move forward, so that you save yourself a little bit of time and figure that stuff out before you start writing. Also, I feel like a lot of books I've read kind of differ on how they explain what constitutes a scene and making a scene. And I kind of liked her definition, though it is a little different than what I've heard elsewhere. I think she defends it and explains it well, and so I do kind of like it like that, and I do plan to think about that more when it comes to working on my own projects. So she basically defines a scene as having 2 or more people in conflict. So you have to have 2 or more people in conflict in order for it to be considered a scene. So yeah, so I'm curious what other people think of that. So comment down below what you think of that idea. But I thought that was an interesting concept. And she has things, so the way I've always thought about books, and most of the craft books that I've read really talk about like everything is a scene, like they're all scenes, and she's saying that's not true. She actually talks about scenes, and then she has like, there's like I forget what she calls it, but like setting up for a scene, and then she has sequels, which I had never heard this concept before. During the live stream, people said that this is not a new concept. There's actually a book called Scenes and Sequels, but this was the first I had ever heard about it, and so I found that very fascinating. It is definitely something I want to look further into in the future of thinking about sequels to scenes. She means sequels in terms of like what comes after a scene, rather than like a sequel to a book or something. So I found that really interesting and helpful, and I definitely, like I said, I want to look into that more, because I've definitely come across in the past things that I'm like, is this a scene? Like, is it missing things that should be constituted a scene? It's making me kind of force things into a scene, whereas if not everything is a scene, then maybe the things I have didn't need to be forced into having things that scenes should have. Does that make sense? Or am I rambling? But anyway, I found that kind of helpful. So I did like that she brought that up. She also really talks about scenes and sequels in terms of AR units, so action reaction, which is something that came up, I believe, in Story Genius, I think, which I reviewed previously on this channel. I will link all my previous craft reviews in a playlist down below if you want to check those out, because I have reviewed quite a few for this channel, and I have a few more for the year coming up. So at least 2 more plus some master classes. So if that's something you're interested in, hit subscribe because you don't want to miss those. Anyway, so I like to think about that in terms of AR units, as you have an action and then the immediate reaction. And she's saying they can be simple or complicated. She was basically talking about like action from one character yields a reaction from another character. So just kind of thinking about scenes and sequels and pairings and couplings. I don't know, I think that can be kind of helpful. And I actually really enjoyed her explanation of that. And like I said, she didn't really go fully into it. Like, from what I've heard, there's books that really do. And that is something that I may actually be pursuing in future Let's Talk Craft book club choices. So I liked that small introduction that she does in the book for that. She also kind of outlines what should happen after the scene. So she kind of gives you, again, she says you should have emotion first, because this is the way she says things naturally happen, right? So she says there should be emotion, thought, action, then dialogue. So I don't know, I just kind of liked having those little like points where she said to, like, you know, like sort of like checklist. I'm a checkbox kind of person. I'm a follow the list kind of person. So when people give me little tidbits like that, that's really helpful for me. And she does that quite a bit in this book, which I found helpful. Another one that she does is when she talks about scene resolution. She says that every scene you should be able to answer one of 4 options as the scene resolution. Like, was this resolved? Yes, no, yes, but, or no and furthermore. So she gets, I don't want to get too much into that. She explains that a lot better. But I felt like that was really helpful, meaning like, no furthermore is like, no, and now things have gotten worse, or like, yes, that was solved, but now a new issue has come up, that kind of thing. So I felt like that was really helpful. It's definitely something that in my rewrite and when I start working on my plotting Bible, which is something I'm about to start creating during Preptober here, I do think I want to implement some of that in there, because I think that's really helpful to make sure that your scenes are kind of getting wrapped up and that they're leading into each other and how they're leading into each other. So then she says after the scene is resolved, that's when you have your sequel. And she says that in the sequels, you should have, instead of like the conflict and whatever's going on in the scene, that you should deal with the emotional aftermath and the analytical thought and the review of the previous story events, of the weighing of options, and making decisions and then taking action from what happened. And so she doesn't go super in depth on those things, but I do, like I said, she kind of dips your toes in those points. I really like those, and I really want to explore those points further. So I appreciate her bringing those up and bringing that to my attention. Now, she did also just give a few like practical little tidbits. So like, she does talk about like really just kind of like not crafty things, but just like you know, what's a good number of POVs to have, depending on like your book fantasy type and what kind of author you are. She does give some tips on the main story question and how it should be answerable by yes or no. She does talk about like varying your scene size, and she gives some practical advice at the end regarding like contracts and publishing. And so stuff like that I thought was kind of just very general like writing advice or like tips getting into publishing that I thought was helpful. And I did like that she at the end kind of says that writing is a performing art. Of course it's an art, but I've never really heard it described as a performing art, and I actually kind of like thinking about it like that. And yeah, so I just kind of like that framing toward the end. So those were the pros. And if you kind of notice, there really wasn't that many pros. I kind of have way more cons than pros, so let's get into those cons. The biggest one of all is it's not really about writing fantasy, y'all. Like if you're going to this being like, I want to write a fantasy like I did, and I feel very uncomfortable with writing fantasy, and I don't know how to write fantasy. This is the fantasy fiction formula. This is going to give me a formula for fiction writing or writing fantasy. No, that's a big fat no, that ain't happening, okay? So it gives very little advice about fantasy writing at all. Instead, it's just very general writing advice and tips on writing as a overall like discussion where she just uses fantasy examples, and that's kind of like her frame of reference when she's talking about things, but she's not really talking about how to write fantasy. So what I mean by that is I was expecting sections on how to world build, how to create magic systems, things that are intimidating, I feel like, or that are unique to fantasy. And both of those topics get less than a page really in the book. So I found that very, very disappointing. Like super disappointing. Some of the tips does lend itself more to fantasy, like they wouldn't quite hold up in the same way for like realistic fiction, but I wouldn't say that it's specific on how to write fantasy. So I feel like that's a huge con of this book, and it's a little misleading if you ask me. Instead, I felt like the book was just a bunch of like offhanded tips. Like literally felt like she was just like, oh yeah, this topic, this is what I think about this topic. Oh yeah, and and this topic, here's a little thing about what I think about this. Like it was just a lot of just one-off advice or tips. It was all very vague. Nothing was a deep dive into anything, and especially how thick that book is. It's just skimming the surface on every topic that comes into the book. There was no clear organization, I felt like. It was just, like I said, it was like, oh, this topic, here's a little chunk of text about this topic. Then we move on to the next topic. Here's a little chunk about that. And it kind of just, I don't know, it was a little all over the place, and nothing really deep or meaty was like being looked into, especially when I've read so many other craft books. I felt like this was not the deep dive into anything in particular that I was looking for. This tends to happen a lot, you guys. Maybe it's just a me thing, but I didn't really care for the tone and the voice in this one. I mean, this is something I pay a lot of attention to in my reviews. There are some that I don't mind, like I don't mind Story Genius, I don't mind Save the Cat, even Writing Deep Scenes wasn't that bad. Hooked was like a little like cringy, but I haven't reviewed that yet, so wait for that. But I just didn't really like her tone in this. I felt like it was a little off-putting. There were just, honestly, also, I just have to say it, I would be remiss if I didn't. There were some problematic things that I found in the book, just saying like ungrammatical and rougher language is for lesser beings, and so she assigns it to lesser beings. She used the word ghetto in the book at one point. She talks about like certain types of victims, who's more likable, what kinds of victims are more likable, who you sympathize more with, what certain types of victims. She has some ableist language in there about people getting things done, and then there are people who make excuses, and I don't know, there was just some language that I feel like should not be sort of used, or like a tone that I just felt like was like, read the room, you know, it's 2020. So I know she wrote it in 2016, but that was not that long ago. So that was just like a little uncomfortable. I hated that she made tons of Harry Potter references. There's other fantasy in the world to reference. And also that doesn't hold up right now, especially because, I'm sorry, you know why, okay? So didn't love that. I thought the exercises that she gave at the end of some of the chapters were not very creative or nuanced in any sort of way. They were kind of boring. I didn't think that they seemed that helpful. I've read so many craft books, taken master classes. I've seen so many writing exercises and examples to give, and I just didn't find any of what she was really recommending seeming that helpful to me or that interesting or nuanced. They seemed like they were just heard those a million times. She gave this very convoluted explanation of her revision process. I thought it seemed, like I said, very convoluted. I didn't think it seemed very helpful. It was actually very confusing. And also, like, she pushes a lot for plotting. So if you're not a plotter, this is not going to appeal to you either. That's pretty par for the course, to be honest, in craft books. Rarely does a craft book really kind of talk about being able to pants or whatever, but that might be a con for you, because if you're not a plotter, I don't think this would work for you. So it just, everything felt very vague, very sort of barely skims the surface, shallow, no talking about fantasy writing. It was just kind of like, nah. I don't know, that's how I felt about it. That's my review. You know, it was just like, ugh. So overall, while there were a few elements of it that I did find helpful, I didn't feel like they were helpful enough to warrant reading this giant book. Like, I don't feel like if I hadn't read that book, that my writing wouldn't be as good. Does that make sense? So like, I feel like I could have just not read it and it wouldn't have hurt me in any way. Like, yeah, those things were helpful, but like, I didn't actually need them. I don't feel like my writing has been elevated by reading this book, or I would miss, you know, I don't think you'd miss out on something if you didn't read it, if I'm being completely honest. There's not enough talk about fantasy at all. I don't even know why fantasy is on the cover, if I'm being completely honest. Nothing about world building, nothing about creating magic systems, nothing about how to balance description versus action, nothing about, you know, training sequences, or I don't know what kinds of character arcs or things that should be happening. I mean, just nothing about actually writing fantasy in particular. She was just using fantasy as the lens in which she was giving overall writing, and I would say advice, not craft. I would not say that this is a craft book in which she really delves into the craft of writing. I think it's just like, she's been writing for a really long time. Someone wanted her opinion on some topics. These are her quick tips that she's learned over time, and that's it. Honestly, that's what it is. Now, if you've never read a craft book before and you write fantasy, then this could be a great first book for you to read in terms of like writing craft. However, nothing gets too specific. I don't think you could end with just this book. I think this could just be like the tipping your toes in the water, and then you would need to check out another book that gets deeper into the craft of writing. Whether that be Save the Cat or Story Genius or Anatomy of Story or something like that, that is a deeper dive, but none of those are really specific to fantasy. If you know about one that's really specific to fantasy and how to do those kinds of things, please comment down below to let me know and others know, but this is not the book, y'all. This is not it. It's just not it. It's not. So overall, like, who would I recommend this book to? People who are novice writers, people who are really new to writing and know they want to write fantasy, have never read a craft book before, and are really just looking for general tips and just to kind of dip their toes into writing craft in general. That's who I would recommend this to, because I do think it is a starting point on some topics of overall writing craft. And if you're like in an intro class, like an introduction to creative writing, I think this could be helpful for that. But if you have been writing for a while, or you're familiar with writing craft at all, I just would pass on this book, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, I hate to say that, but it's just the truth. So would I recommend this book? What would I rate it? Honestly, I think I rated it like a 2. I would maybe give it like a 2.5 at the most. Overall, I just didn't love it. Nothing really stuck with me. I will use very little of it. And if I didn't use anything at all, I think my writing would still be fine. I think my writing has not improved by reading it. I don't feel better as a writer by reading it. I don't feel like I know more about writing fantasy since reading it. I really just overall don't think it made a big impact on me. So overall, do I think you have to read this book? No. No, I don't. Okay, so that's just me. That's just my opinion. But if you are new to writing and new to fantasy and you want to check it out, I will have it linked down in the description. I do think it does set up some new ideas, but it's just not deep enough. I want the meat, you know? I want to sink my teeth into some ideas. And so I guess the thing I'm most grateful for is the introduction to the ideas of scenes and sequels, and I will be looking into that more in other craft books, but this is just not the one for me. Sorry. So, all right, guys, that is this review. If you enjoyed my honest review of this book, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, because that tells YouTube that this is some quality content that people would actually get something out of. If you are not already subscribed and you enjoy learning about more craft books and you want more of me reading the books to tell you whether or not it's worth your time and effort, and if you also want to see someone chronicling their really long, arduous journey towards trying to become a traditionally published young adult author, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. And I try to post videos 2 times a week, plus live streaming once a week with my brother Kevin. So yeah, that's the tea, sis. That's what I think and how I feel, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.